Yes.
side? I will sit on this side.
Yeah, yeah. Just a second.
Okay. Hello, 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 and a very warm welcome to our event here on defense as Europe's trump card, strategies to safeguard EU against potential American retrenchment. And so, first of all, congratulations to the comms team for having thought about that title. It's really a great title, because we want to start off by discussing Trump and a potential return of President Trump to the White House. And then we have the honor to have Stefano Sannino with us. He will join us in a few minutes, Secretary General of the European External Action Service. And we will hear, I'm sure, from him quite some remarks about EDIS, which is, for Bruegel aficionados, it's not the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, it is the European Defense Industrial Strategy. Before he arrives, we want to talk about Trump. And so my name is, in fact, Guntram Wolf, and I'm a senior fellow here at Bruegel. And I'm really pleased today to be with Arantxa González-Laya, who's dean at the School for International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain. And Arantxa and I had this idea a few months ago to actually think about what would a possible return of Donald Trump to the White House mean for Europe, the European Union. And we thought, okay, we have to pull together a team of European thought leaders. And we did so and published a piece in Foreign Affairs, which is called Trump-Proofing Europe. And the piece was written by 5 colleagues from the 5 biggest EU countries. It's not only very gender balanced and very geography balanced, it also is expertise balanced. So we have had explicitly an expert in security strategies, Camille Grand, a former NATO high-level official, and we had democracy experts, economic experts, and political experts. So the idea was really to take a comprehensive look at what a possible return of President Trump to the White House would mean. And when we started that strategy and that paper, we very quickly realized that this is really a multidimensional challenge, right? And so we focused on the hard security questions. We focused on the economic questions, and we focused quite a bit also on challenges to democracy that such an event could constitute. And so I would say we start off by, Arantxa, perhaps hearing from you a quick pitch about the paper. I will complement what you've said, and then we hope that by that time the Secretary General will have arrived, and we want to then deep dive into, in particular, the EDIS strategy of the European Union, and do that with the Secretary General. So, Arantxa, please.
Thank you, Guntram. Thanks a lot also to Bruegel for hosting us today in what I hope will be the beginning of a conversation about not only about what Europe needs to do, especially as we look into a new set of European leaders in the institutions, as we look at a new cycle in Europe after the elections in June, but also who, that we will know after the election, but what and how we want to do. The beginning of this conversation and the reason why we wrote this paper is because we see the world around the European Union changing. The world changing for Europe's prosperity, the world changing for Europe's security, the world changing for Europe's democracy. and a bit a desire that the decisions that Europe needs to take be determined by Europe in June rather than by the 140,000 US voters in November. And I'm saying this because this is how we frame the exercise, and in our view, this is how we have to frame the European elections of June. The elections will be about whether or not Europe can shape its own future, in which case the EU has to do a bit of homework, or whether the future of the EU will be defined by voters in the US or maybe by leaders in other countries where citizens don't get to vote. This is, in a nutshell, the proposal we wanted to discuss today. Obviously, there's three big dimensions in what we think needs doing. An economic dimension that has to do with Europe's competitiveness, of which a big part we will get greater, more in detail ideas, presumably from Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi, the two Europeans that are working to give us a sense of how to tap into the depth that the single market offers, and the challenges that Europe competitiveness faces today. There is a democracy dimension to it, and I think it's not enough that the EU laments about the state of democracy around the world, but rather that the EU also works a little bit in improving its own democracy, and that it uses the instruments that it has when it faces situations in European Union member states that do not uphold European standards on democracy, and that it does that not only because we want to take Europe's democracy seriously, but also because if we don't do it in Europe, we'll be accused of double standards when we say others have to do it outside Europe. The third big piece, and is the one where we want to focus today, has to do with Europe's security. So how does Europe prepare for a world where its main security provider, NATO, which is of which Europe is a big stakeholder, but how can the European Union prepare when the main stakeholder, the main shareholder in this defense alliance that is NATO, may end up wanting to maybe not only not have a, let's say, constructive view vis-a-vis NATO, but may end up having a hostile view about members of NATO that we are. And this is where we call the paper Trump-proving Europe, but we also are clear, and I think we also wanted to put this on the table. We are clear that whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's Joe Biden that the Americans elect as presidents, and we will obviously be respectful of the choice they make, there is a pendulum on the US side that is swinging more in the direction of isolation, is swinging more in the direction of focusing in other regions of the world, in particular the Pacific, which speaks of the necessity for Europe to take more responsibility for its own security, more responsibilities for the alliance that is European, also alliance for security, which is called NATO. So this is a bit the landscape that the backdrop that we wanted to paint for a good debate. And on this, we have Stefano that has arrived to save me before I could start taking apart the European EDIs. So let's give Stefano the possibility to put it on the table before we take it apart.
No. Well, thank you so much, Arantxa, and indeed thank you also for coming, Stefano. It's great to have you here. I mean, perhaps just two more words about our Trump paper before asking you perhaps more specifically a question about about EDIS, which I think is really the big interest by many at the moment. I think the first really important point in our paper is that we are really calling on Europeans to develop a joined-up common strategy to deal with global disruptions. The temptation will be to strike bilateral deals, right? I mean, to come up with bilateral deals, transactional. We know President Trump, was a very transactional president. Let's have bilateral deals with him, also to safeguard our security. What we are saying is, well, basically, if we do this, we risk not only losing a lot of domestic capacity to react, but we also really don't have much bargaining power, right? So come up with a joint strategy, pull together. And this is difficult for Europeans because, of course, historically, we as Europeans have been quite often reliant on American sponsorship of the European integration project. I mean, this goes back to the Eurozone. It goes back to the foundation of the EU, but also to the Eurozone crisis. I remember very well the Eurozone crisis period was a period where the US Secretary of the Treasury was very often here in Brussels talking to the ECOFIN ministers, sort of trying to convince people to actually agree on some solution that works, right? Now, without that kind of sponsorship from the United States, will we be able to pull together? And this is along all the dimensions that Arantxa mentioned, right? The defense dimension, the economic dimension, but also the democracy dimension. I have to say, the events of the last 2 weeks don't make me particularly optimistic at the current stage, but who knows? I mean, things might change. But certainly, Franco-German disagreement on basics of security strategy communication is certainly an issue and a big concern. And I think the Eastern Europeans clearly need some reassurance, given how the US, how Russia is beefing up its own military capacities. So this is perhaps just as a sort of teaser on the Trump paper on EDIS. I mean, this was a very interesting publication, and perhaps just my initial reaction. I mean, I see that the strategy is really an attempt to increase the capacity of the European defense industry, which I think is to be welcomed. At the same time, what is less clear to me is why the specific goals that it sets in terms of domestic production goals for and reduction of import dependencies in military procurement, why that would be actually a positive factor for security. I mean, and that's perhaps my first question, but I mean, I'm sort of already quite specific question, but obviously when you have a demand shock for a certain good, I mean, now speaking from the economics, when you have a demand shock for a specific good in a specific region, you would expect that good to be imported more. And that's exactly what happened in defense. We increased our imports of defense goods massively during this war. And so did Russia, by the way. I mean, Russia increased its imports of defense material massively from North Korea, from Iran, and others. And so did we, not from North Korea, fortunately, but from other partners. And the strategy now postulates that we should sort of go back to a state where the import quota is even much less, and the UK, by the way, is not included in the strategy, which also was for me a question, at least raising a question mark. So, I mean, so I'm already talking a lot about quite some specific issues, but I'm really happy to have you here. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to your remarks on EDIS in general, but also on these specific issues. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and apologies for being late, but I'm just coming back from 4 hours with the North Atlantic Council in Nevers, so it's, I don't know if I've been trained enough for me, because a lot of the discussion was also about this. Let me say a few things, and then open the debate, which I think is more interesting. First of all, on the background, and because EDIS is not, or EDIP, I mean, it is both the strategy and the program are not coming out of the blue, but are the result of a certain process. And I think that we have to put this in the perspective of the war in Ukraine, I mean, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, but also the growing security concerns that we have on a number of scenarios. I mean, I don't need to tell you, Middle East, Sahel, and potentially in the East. So there is a sense which is felt quite strongly within the European Union that for too long we have not invested enough, or better, we have disinvested in the security sector. And this is a point that Borrell has made many times, that essentially we have not been able to, let's say, to look at the security in this way. I think that it was also the outcome of a certain conception of the world up to a certain point. No? The idea that the globalization, the single supply chains, that the changes through trade would have had a positive effect also on our security. In all this, I think that there is also an element which is linked to the what we see, I don't know how to call them in a constructive way, neo-isolationist trends in the United States that, I mean, are quite evident in the sense that the country seems to be focused much more on its own internal problems, support of the economy and so on, and that's maybe can be even accelerated by the elections with the change of administration. So, I mean, this is a little bit the perspective. We have spoken for quite some time about the strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty of the European Union. I'm not afraid to use this term. I think that the whole story of the European Union is about strategic autonomy. I mean, all the instruments that we have created from, let's say, our trade policy onwards, I mean, are all instruments that are supposed to have a Europe which is stronger on its feet and on its capacity to take care of its own security, resilience, and so on. One point that on which I think that we need to, and then I will come and say a few words on EDIS. One thing that we have seen during the war, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and the need to support militarily Ukraine, is that essentially our production was not sufficient. And somehow we were unable to provide Ukraine with the kind of arms and munitions that were needed by Ukraine. We have, I think that we have not done too badly. I mean, European Peace Facility has shown its worth in essentially mobilizing a little bit more than 6 billion euros. We have managed to leverage more than 17 billion euros in terms of supplies for Ukraine. And this is not done only, let's say, buying European. On the contrary, I mean, largest part of the EPF has gone to finance essentially acquisition done in third countries. I mean, 62% in the United States, just to be clear, and more if we consider also other countries. Now, what we wanted to do with the strategy was essentially to do two things at the same time. On the one hand, to, let's say, provide the European Union with the means to continue supporting Ukraine over the long term, for the needs of Ukraine, but also to substantially increase the capacity of the European Union to produce armaments and ammunitions. And this is not in a vacuum, but in a context of the NATO alliance, and that's another, again, coming back from NATO, it is quite clear that there is a clear sense of complementarity, and it cannot be otherwise. 23 NATO allies are also members of the European Union. So, understand that there is always a certain degree of schizophrenia when it comes to the to reason in NATO terms or in EU terms, but still the concept of the single set of standards, in the EU and NATO, and the interoperability of the system is still a very important part of it. So, two things: support Ukraine, but also to increase the industrial capacity of the European Union. One thing that is also important is that we are in defining the standards for our activity, we are looking at NATO standards. So we are not inventing new standards, are not defining, let's say, different standards from the one that we are using in NATO. And somehow the other element which is also very clear is that we are not excluding companies that are not, let's say, have their presence in Europe. So if there is a third country company with a presence in Europe, with the management in Europe, and that, let's say, the security standards are allowing us essentially to use these ammunitions and these armaments without being subject to the authorization of a third government, this is not, let's say, a closed mechanism, so it is open. It's open to collaboration. It's open to cooperation. But the sense is that apart the need to provide support to Ukraine, it's also to enhance again the industrial capacity in Europe, because there is a need of doing more from that point of view. So we are not excluding, and there are, by the way, there are some of our member states, a number of our member states whose economic systems, especially when it comes to the industrial sector, to the military industrial sector, which are very much integrated into the systems of other countries like the UK or the US. And we will need to have an honest and open discussion about this. Let's consider that the process has just started. EDIS is the proposal, and then it has to be discussed by member states, and we will need to see how this is going to take shape, including, and that's my last point, including the financing component, because it is for the moment we are, or at least the proposal is to have 1.5 billion euro to launch the program, but it is evident that this is not sufficient. And we will need to see a source of financing. In the strategy, we are already identifying the possibility of leveraging loans of the European Investment Bank, which could in turn open to the banking sector. We have also, let's say, suggested the idea of the possibility of issuing bonds. Not always easy. But still there is another option. There is also the option of using the windfall profits of the immobilized assets in Europe. So there are a number of potential sources of financing, but again, we will need to discuss this much more substantially, because it is evident that even if this is only seed money, which is not supposed to finance the the production, but more the joint procurement, the partnerships of our industry, still there will be much more in terms of financing that is going to be needed.
Well, I mean, there were so many points now. Perhaps, Arantxa, you want to react to a few points, and then I add a few comments, and then perhaps we give back to Stefano. And then, of course, our esteemed audience, we also want you to ask questions. The online audience can ask questions on Slido with the password #safeguard. And the ones in the room can just raise their hands, and we'll get you to ask some questions. Arantxa, please.
So in honor of Stefano, I decided to respond to his presentation with Sergio Leone, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So all of them important, but I think I like to give a bit of a topography of how I perceive these proposals. First, the good. I think it is very important that you put this paper on the table, because we have a problem with political framing of this priority. And this political framing of this priority, which in a democracy is extremely important, because at the end of the day, it has to be supported by voters, is what this paper does, and in my view, does well. Explain that it's not about the EU turning into a war machine, but the EU being capable of defending its peace project, also if others attack the EU militarily, which is, in my view, a good signal to give. So on this one, kudos, because it's important to convince the European citizens. By and large, they tell us 80% that they want more EU defense. By and large, they tell us more than 65% that they are in favor of more spending on defense. But as we all know, the devil will be on the details. So thank you for opening this conversation, and also sending a very strong signal of something that in my view is essential in this discussion, which is it's about protecting the European citizens, it's about protecting the European model, but it's also about the European competitiveness, because behind this paper it's EU defense industry. And this is not a small part of the EU economy. It's an important one. And in my view, it's an important one that should play a bigger role and now let's look into the rest of the conditions. The bad, I think it's 1.5 billion, which is what the margin in the MFF between 2025 and 27, frankly, is not very impressive. Now, we all know that it's about leveraging. We know that this is not going to be the financing piece, but we also need to send a better signal on financing. Now, if you dig deep into the papers that were issued, and you have to dig deep, you find a few good ideas on the financing. What good ideas, in my view? One, we've got to open this discussion about joint borrowing to invest collectively in defense. And this should be no taboo, because at the end of the day, we can't say we want to have more value for money and not being able to cross this line also for something that concerns each and every member state, which is defending Europe. I think we have to be a bit bolder on the ability of the EIB, the European Investment Bank, to lend in the defense and security space. But we also need to change the culture of private banks that have been reluctant to lend, because this was not perceived to be very orthodox. So let's make it very orthodox. So on financing, we have a bit of work to do. The ugly, in my view, is if the first F was about framing, if the second F was about financing, the third F is about fragmentation. And there, in my view, we have to be more ambitious. So a few ideas of where to be more ambitious. One is on innovation. for now, we have, and this is something that has happened in the last 5 years, so it's good, better coordination of the innovation centers around defense and security in the member states. In my view, we have to cross a bit of a line and build the European equivalent to the US DARPA for defense innovation in Europe. Rather than fragmenting or trying to coordinate, let's leverage better the EU research and development financing to do this at scale, to look at where tech disruptions linked to military applications, where can we concentrate more forcefully financing, and let's do this in the form of projects, which is what Europe knows to do. On markets, I think we don't, it's very interesting if you look at the European Union, the 4 areas where the EU is deficient today is the 4 areas where the EU has not done a single market. Telecoms digital, energy, capital markets, and defense and security. We are not going to build a single market in one step, but we could at least try to build a common market, which would be the beginning of this conversation. Finally, on the ugly part, I think the paper is good at what the Commission is good at doing, but in my view, it's not leveraging enough the intergovernmental part. And blend it a little bit better with this capacity that the EU, that the Commission can have to be this front runner, articulating better the different actions on the member states. So constructive comments, I hope, that can help in the discussions that no doubt we'll have with member states.
Two fingers on, and thanks. I mean, honestly, I thought worse when you started with the bad. On the good, I mean, you said it. I mean, I was trying to say the same. You said it better. I mean, essentially, it's how to say it's, and this is quite amazing in a way that the European Union, for those who have been around for quite some time, has always been very reluctant, or I would say adverse to the idea of having industrial policies, active industrial policies. We just wanted to create a level playing field, but not, let's say, promoting any industrial policy. So the fact that we are doing now, and we are doing in the defense sector, is not bad from that point of view. And as you say, the framing, the competitiveness, it's a very valid point. On the financing, I was honestly saying it. I mean, I think that it is evident that with the instruments that we have at our disposal, that was more or less the maximum that could be done. We could not find, let's say, more resources within the budget. But to me, on the EIB, I'm more positive, and I think that we can move there, and I think that the banking sector, the private banking sector, can do that. Remember that a couple of years ago, we were speaking about taxonomy, and we were thinking that essentially the military investments should not be covered by taxonomy. So I mean, we are moving fast. So it's I think that, and that's will. But the real point, I think, it's about the idea of the joint borrowing, and that's where we need to make a real breakthrough. But there again, we have some good examples, and even if there is some reluctance in some of our member states, we could manage to move in that direction. On the point of fragmentation, I think that there is one, and that's true. I'm a little bit more positive because there is a change in mentality. I mean, up until now, we have been reluctant to spend in defense because somehow this was not popular with our public opinions, was not popular with our constituencies and electorate. Now, slowly, I would say there is a awareness of the fact that security has a cost. And if you want to have security, you need to pay something. I mean, you need to invest in this sector. So there is what you were speaking about, the intergovernmental component. I'm not saying that it will, let's say, come in and fall in the right place very rapidly, but there is a movement going in that direction. And it's the same movement, and you were mentioning the 4 areas, which are also the basis of the report of Enrico Letta on the single market. And one is, as a matter of fact, the defense sector. We will need to overcome the typical mentality in this sector, where you were doing specificities for whatever in order to make sure that you had no internal competition. When we speak about the famous 155 ammunitions, I think that in Europe we have 17 different kinds of 155 ammunitions with the different specifications that are not enabling to be used on all the different military systems. So it's a long way. But once again, if I have to judge from where we started when the war erupted in Ukraine, well, I mean, some hope that we can move rapidly from ugly, at least, into something less ugly. It is possible.
Wonderful. I mean, perhaps just to push you on two or three more points. I mean, one is the one that Arantxa mentioned in terms of the citizens' preference for European defense spending, which I think in all the surveys is actually very big, and the reluctance of our governments to actually want to do it. Now you mentioned the interest of the defense industry, which is sort of often very closely interlinked with national procurement offices and so on and so forth. And you know, I made the analogy in a piece in Politico last week, basically making the comparison to banking union, where of course the link between governments and national administrations and the banking system is very close. Yet to have a real single market, you need to overcome that very strong link. And of course, citizens seem to be further ahead than some of the national politicians and national political systems. So where do you see the strategy for moving from one to another system? I mean, this is, to my mind, and that's the answer we give in our Trump paper, is basically this should be a big topic in the European elections, right? And it should be really something driven by citizens. The second point, I mean, just to reiterate this point on where do we want production to increase? I mean, we have a big shock for global security, and it's very concentrated in Europe. Now, the world defense industry is actually benefiting. I mean, US firms, European firms, North Korean firms, South Korean firms, they all have seen huge increases in their market valuation because the demand is going up, right? And so we will import more weapons from the rest of the world. And that's a good thing. And it was needed short term, certainly. Of course, we need to also increase our domestic production, but do we need to shift the balance between imports and domestic productions long term or not? I mean, I'm not so clear on it. I mean, if you think there is a significant security issue, and that comes back to perhaps the Trump issue, I mean, perhaps we have to prepare for a world where it will be more difficult to secure and procure the kind of weapons we need from the US for whatever reason, political reasons. But unless you come up with an argument like that, I don't necessarily see why the import share should sort of fall, right? So perhaps you can just dwell a little bit on that and also say one or two words about the UK in that context, because of course, also given the possible political change in the UK, this is really an opportunity for doing something together with Great Britain, to my mind. Last point, I mean, since you mentioned the joint funding is needed and so on, and I'm all in favor of joint funding projects. I mean, then we have to talk about very quickly joint procurement, and of course the big difficulty with joint procurement is that we don't have one army, right? I mean, we have 27 armies, and all of them have exactly their own specificities and so on and so forth. So how do we go about, is this a gradual process where we sort of start by taking the 155 millimeter shells as an example and say, okay, here is a system that's relatively simple, right? It's been around for 40 years. It's a relatively standardized product. So let's sort of simplify here, standardize, and jointly procure, and do that with joint borrowing. And then we gradually grow the pie to more weapon systems, or do we take a completely different approach? I mean, just give us a sense of sort of the strategic approach in that space. And then I open up for questions. Sorry.
Okay, I try not to be too long. I mean, to be very honest, I think I don't know if to have, let's say, defense as a big topic in European elections, it's something that will make its way through. I mean, I may understand that it is a big issue, but I mean, you have also, let's say, I'm not saying that you need to hide this, but it has to be part of I would say, a broader discussion about the competitiveness of our economy. If I look, for example, sorry, I don't want to try to avoid your question, but if you look at the strategic agenda that we are developing, one of the points, of the main point of the strategic agenda is also really about the competitiveness of the European economy in its different components. And that has also a huge impact on the security aspect, because we're speaking about hard security here, about military security, but then there is also the big chapter of the economic security, and which is another important component, or other elements like, I don't know, disinformation or hybrid and so on, and cyber and so on. So I think that we will need to, let's say, progressively to make it clear that security is a cost, and so we need to include in our evaluation and what is going to be done, that we cannot keep on sacrificing the security budgets, the military budgets of our country. But again, I think that has to be framed properly in order to avoid any kind of backlash. And especially now towards the European elections, and then maybe in 1 year time it will be a different story, and maybe what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic may have an impact. But now it's difficult to have this in our calculus, I would say. On the point of the changing the balance of the import-export, I don't know. I mean, this is changing. By the way, we are speaking a lot about Ukraine and support Ukraine, but there is another very interesting part that is happening, and it is the replacement of the purchase that India is doing in the market. And that's interesting because, I mean, part of it is being taken by the Europeans, namely by France, which has increased substantially its selling to India. What we need to do, for me, it's not that much of changing or shifting the ratio about import-export, but let's say increasing the capacity across the board. And that's what we are trying to do. At the end of the day, we are not trying to replace the US industry or the UK industry, but we are trying to ramp up our own capacities and what we are producing in Europe, because once again, we have seen that there is a dramatic shortage. There is a dramatic shortage when it comes to the Ukrainian needs, but there is also a dramatic shortage, and that links into your further question about what we do not have and we should have in order to have more stability in our own capacities. So, I mean, for me, this is not a question of production replacing imports, And in a way, even now, and again, I don't want to sound pedagogic or pedantic, but what we are doing, for example, in the European Peace Facility, this new supplemental addition to the European Peace Facility, we are trying to use part of it to keep on buying what is necessary wherever we can buy it, and part of it to also to push the European industrial production. In a way, if we have to push the production in one third country or in Europe, why don't we try to do it in Europe? Why don't we try to provide, let's say, a more stable basis for our industrial production? I mean, personally, I think that it would be a good thing to do it in a broader perspective. I have nothing against the idea of a transatlantic market, but then we have also to be honest in saying that then, I mean, it's a two-way street. And it's not just one way, especially considering the security limitations that that are put on the experts coming from the United States. And again, no criticism, it's just the reality. It's the fact that if you cannot re-export, as it has been the case from some countries, then it becomes very, very problematic. I think that you are right that I would say so the effort is about really not purchasing but procuring. So the point of how we can enhance the capacity of the 27 to procure together, and that was also the point of the Defense Fund and now of EDIP, is what you can do to incentivize the industrial sector to procure together. The idea of, for example, of not paying the VAT on joint procured products, I think it's a good incentive from a certain point of view that can help, let's say, to overcome the division and the fragmentation. And then it's what Arantxa was saying before, but to do that you need to overcome also the mentality. I mean, remember that, again, till yesterday, including the tires of the trucks were had to be procured nationally, because it was a security issue not to have dependencies from the different components. It's a bottom-up approach. We'll have to start from a number of elements, I mean, the enablers, the ammunition, and so on. Then progressively, over time, I mean, and that's what Arantxa was saying about the fact of what the Commission does best, to create a different mentality, a different readiness to really to move together. Then you know that even within the communitarized policies, a little bit of competition is always present.
Wonderful. So let's take some questions. 3 questions. Who would like to ask a question? Please raise your hand. So
Thank you very much for the interesting debate. I'm Carlo Brenner from Citigroup, the American bank. And so I have a few questions, actually. So to start with, like, how to place in the various framework of initiatives the latest. So, like, how should we interpret this in conjunction with the global gateway? Not global gateway, sorry, the strategic compass. So the strategic compass in relation to this last initiative is like the compass, as the name says, or something else, or is already too old. The strategic compass is overcome. Then another question, like the scenario apart from the last plan that was presented, and also about the timing. So this plan was presented now by the Commission. There is no time to discuss it. So what is the meaning? How shall we interpret this presentation from the Commission in this specific moment when we are at the end of a legislative cycle? Is a sort of propaganda, is a manifesto for the next Commission? And concerning the next Commissioner on Defense, is there really a chance that it's going to be a Commissioner in Defense or not?
links to the initial remark on imports made by Guntram, and also on your point when you ask, okay, why should not be building more in Europe? Okay, let me try to give an answer. Purchasing power parities. There are some work done. I mean, purchasing power parity, usually people know, they make you know that if you buy a hamburger in Zurich, it will cost you 3 or 4 times than buying the hamburger in Lisbon. Some economists have done the work on the military. And, okay, not surprisingly, the US is the most expensive country, even when you adjust for quality. But European countries are not that distant. By contrast, the likes of Turkey, Brazil, basically, we have a relation about 3. So basically, you buy 3 hamburgers with the same amount of euro, and you were just making the point that there are no euros because, I mean, the figure that I've mentioned are kind of a pittance, I mean, in the budget, 1.5 billion. So shouldn't one factor in this elementary element, bearing in mind that I am afraid that all these polls showing that people are willing to spend more on defense, I wonder what the answer would be. Are you willing to cut 1 point of GDP of pension expenditure in exchange of higher defense? I've never seen a poll like this, but it would be interesting to see.
Thank you. Mario Arriagada from the Open Society Foundations. So my question is on the framing and financing. I like the 3 Fs that Arantxa proposed. On the framing, I see the importance of not putting this in the basket of the de-risking rhetoric and how it has to be a 2-way avenue. I see the diplomatic virtue on that framing. However, most of the, and this goes to the financing in a way, most of what is perceived to be a problem for the European Union is that it's behind in the technological sector. So it's not really about the price of a single bullet or the standards that it's built with, but that the investment perhaps should go to the more technological side of military innovation, for which it's required a particular form of industrial policy that does involve some form of de-risking. The dependency on the US is bad, it's enormous. And the European Union might invest better their money, their little money, in that particular sector, which would beg the question on how to make that industrial effort, industrial military complex, so to speak, a la European, different to the one that exists in America, that has worked in ways that make it really expensive, and in the side of the critics, like the Open Society Foundation, very self-devouring in the way it sort of munches the budget of the American people.
So we have the last question in the room.
Thank you very much. Panos Gredes, European Public Organization. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Let me first of all be a bit provocative relating to your, since we have your distinguished speakers here. I think that again this time the European Union just reacted. As reacted to the economic crisis previously, just arranged very late to have a common borrowing, have a reaction also in the good one in the pandemic, also a reaction related to the energy crisis, where up to now, due to aggression work in Ukraine from Russia, European Union paid more than 60 billion euros to countries outside the Union instead of using the resources for us. And similarly, I see that we finance external countries for defense. And is an illusion to discuss nowadays about common foreign security defense policy, since this is on the table from the 50s. Thank you.
So I want to add from Slido, because we literally have 5 minutes left. So let me just add one question from Slido, and then we are good, because it's impossible to do all of them, unfortunately. And I would say we choose the one by Ella, which is about how to respect national competence for defense policy when EDIP, and you'll have to explain what EDIP is, gives increased powers to regarding, for example, to instruct companies to produce certain products. I mean, so the national competency question. So I'm sorry if we can't take all questions, but time is very limited. So perhaps Arantxa and Stefano, you each try to give a step to some of those questions.
Yeah, I think we have not discussed one thing that would matter a lot, to the question of whether we organize the market, you know, we produce this much, you produce this much, we buy it here, we import it there. I think we haven't discussed the thing that matters, which is planning for priorities at the European level. Businesses anywhere in the world require a signal. It's no different in the defense sector. They require a signal from governments. And we have not done this at the European level, and we need to do this at the European level. Europe has very good defense sector businesses, industries, but these industries are in a market where priorities are defined by states, and states have not been defining these priorities. Not for today or tomorrow, but in the long term. So what we need is a good doses of European planning of priorities, which is what give a signal to businesses in Europe and abroad that Europe is serious about the defense sector. Very quickly, I mean, I follow a bit the Chinese. I don't care the color of the cat, provided it catches the mouse. So, I mean, I don't think it's very useful to discuss why this communication came out now. I think what matters is that we do something with it, right? Whomever is there, whether it's this commission, the next parliament, the member states, that we appropriate. And we appropriate this starting now, because the situation is for now. One thing that I'm missing in the paper, by the way, is this sense of urgency. It's not for yesterday. If we're talking about ammunition and we are talking Ukraine, it's not for tomorrow, it's for yesterday. So this sense of urgency is, in my view, how we should see the paper. Finally, to your question, yes, we tried to do the defense, the community on the European defense in the 40s, end of the 40s. Didn't work. Yes, we tried to do the energy single market, and it's taken us a bit of a while, and the telecom and the banking union, yes, it is difficult, but maybe what we know from Europe's history is that when there is a serious enough trigger, we get the political energy to cross that line. So in my view, what we need to make sure is that we consider today's situation as to be so critical that it provides us the trigger to do a number of reforms that will allow us to move to the next stage.
Well, indeed, the situation is very serious, and I just as a reminder, when we discussed defense union in the 50s, it was killed by de Gaulle, but it was the moment when Konrad Adenauer said it's the worst day of his political career. So this, I think, already at the time, there was a clear sense how important this is in some quarters, but now the urgency is really very big. Please.
Well, complementing what Arantxa was saying, I think that the strategic compass is still valid, is still a sort of framework for a defense strategy. I mean, it's the EDIS is a defense industrial strategy, it's the industrial component. The strategic compass is a vision of what defense should be, not only from the point of view of the production, but also on the point of view of action, of the point of view of the partnerships. So the framework is still valid. And I cannot agree more with Arantxa about the sense of urgency. And I think that, I mean, we should all try to get into the state of mind that 2024 is not a transition year. Because, I mean, the state of mind that is everything will happen in 2025, as if 2024 is not relevant for a number of security concerns, including what is happening in Ukraine. So, I mean, I don't know, I don't think that there is any kind of propaganda, but there is a sense of the need to move fast in this sector. And you see also the proliferation of initiatives, which is indicative of this. I think that why do we have to produce in Europe, even if, because if you do not create a production in Europe, we will continue to be dependent all our life on someone else. I'm sorry, I'm not an economist, so I won't pretend to give you any lessons about that, but it is true that the idea of having a sort of ideal division of the factors of production around the world, it's something that has gone. We have unfortunately learned a hard lesson. I don't know if this is going to the de-risking basket of the economic security basket, but certainly there is a need to give ourselves the instruments for our security, because with Russia at the borders, and again, I mean, we are now sitting relatively in a relaxed way here in Brussels, but if we would have this discussion in Riga or in Tallinn or even in Warsaw, maybe the sense of urgency of the threat would be slightly different. And so, I mean, you won't have be only dependent on third countries. And one maybe concerning the, I don't know if we are reactive. I mean, we had our own vision, and I was saying before, and I'm not critical about what has been done in the past and the choices that we've been done in the past. We have tried to integrate countries, to integrate the economic systems, political systems into ours, to create interdependencies. But then, whether we like it or not, this has become a problem, and this has become a vulnerability for our systems. And if we want to preserve the openness of our systems, we need to protect the openness of our system against those who are using and abusing it. On the point of the national competencies, I mean, again, as I said, the discussion is at the beginning, and we will need to see at the end of the day, which is the landing zone. It is true that there is an element of, let's say, of an indication that should come from the institutions to decide what to do and where to focus. But it is also true that there is a very strong cooperation, which is, let's say, embedded in the strategy of cooperation with the industrial sector. So we are not doing, or the institutions will not do that in a vacuum, but will do that in close cooperation with the industries and with the consent of the member states. So, and there again, this is also another point to take into consideration. The industrial sector, the military industrial sector, has always been a very special industrial sector with a very close cooperation with the governments, because at the end of the day, it were the governments who were the final buyers of their products. Sure. So, I mean, there is a tradition, I would say, of very intense cooperation between industry, national level, to which we'll need to add also the European level if we want to overcome the fragmentation that Arantxa was referring to before.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, this is a really big and complex topic. I think we will have to discuss it a second and a third time for sure. But thank you so much for the great discussion, Arantxa and Stefano. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for the great questions. All the best. Bye-bye.